While studying to be a Jesuit priest at Georgetown University, William Peter Blatty heard of a case involving an exorcism of a young man. He developed an immediate curiosity and passion about the subject, which later manifested itself in a book that he wrote called The Exorcist. The film, which became an extension of Blatty's studies, impacted millions of viewers and once again opened that ancient door for a discussion about the possibility of demonic possession. Regardless of your personal beliefs on this or any other subject in the jukebox, I think you will find this conversation to be provocative and quite intriguing.
I'll tell you what's on tap for tonight. My guest, my in-person live guest, is William Peter Blatty. He wrote a book called The Exorcist. William Blatty has read everything in the English language on the subject of exorcism and is absolutely a remarkable man. And the conversation is going to discuss, in our conversation, I think we're going to cover the demonic in general. What do I mean by the demonic in general, or the demonic in private? The demonic is essentially that force within each of us that occasionally crawls out of its shell and is responsible for you snapping somebody's head off. You know? Not necessarily physically, although it manifests itself that way too sometimes. It's just that part of you that becomes angry, that deals in violence, possessiveness, selfishness, frustration, hostility, illness. That part of you that you find sometimes so very difficult to repress or control. When we talk about the demonic, that's what I mean. Now, you might consider it by its classical definition as being related to Satan or something else possessing your body. At any rate, I think that'll be interesting. William Blatty, it's a delight having you here, and I thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure being here.
Tell us about what originally brought you to the subject of exorcism, not specifically the book, but the subject in general.
Yes, when I was an undergraduate at Georgetown University in 1947, I heard of a case of alleged demonic possession that took place in Mount Rainier in Maryland. The Jesuits were involved in this particular case, and the details that were recounted to me, and they were always the same, no matter from what source I heard them, and at what time. For instance, in returning to Washington, D.C. and Georgetown, I heard from still a new source the same details about this particular case that I'd heard in 1947. And it was written up in the Journal of the American Psychiatric Association around that time. It did not involve a Catholic family, although the Jesuits wound up performing an exorcism. I don't know what denomination the victim belonged to, a Protestant sect. There were paranormal phenomena accompanying this particular case that were verified. The boy was under intensive observation, finally, in Menninger Clinic, and some of the paranormal phenomena persisted even there, and therefore I suppose we would say reliably reported. And upon returning to the Washington area, the mother again resorted to her minister, and he suggested, since psychiatry could not cope with it, that she go to Catholic priests. They claimed to be able to do something about this, whether for the reasons stated or not. But it seemed to work at times, and that is precisely what she did. An exorcism was performed that lasted approximately 2 months. And
the actual ritual lasted 2 months?
Yes, the ritual of exorcism in the Catholic Church, and there are hundreds of rituals and rites of exorcism within and outside of the context of any particular religious persuasion. That ritual is about 10 pages of prayer mixed with rather scathing and beautifully scathing, savage adjurations to the demon or the evil spirit to depart. And it is repeated over and over again. And it is constructed also for its psychological benefit. The Catholic Church, and I speak of this ritual of exorcism since that's what the exorcist concerns.
I see.
A Jesuit psychiatrist who performs an exorcism. The Catholic Church will, even when the paranormal phenomena have been authenticated, that is to say, when they are exterior and verifiable, and have been verified, and even when psychiatry has been resorted to and cannot account for all of the manifestations or the syndrome, even then the Catholic Church only makes what we would call a prudent judgment, that this may be a genuine case of possession. It looks like one. But the ritual is designed to have a psychological benefit, in case it is not, in case it is merely hysteria or the result of suggestion. Because if the disorder, the state of possession, has been caused by suggestion, then obviously the counter-reactive suggestion, or the antidote or the cure, would be exorcism, providing the victim believes in it. And so that is why the demon, among other things, is always addressed in that particular ritual of exorcism. At any rate, to come back, that case so startled and stunned me, fascinated me at the time.
Just intellectually or on other levels?
On an emotional level. I was educated in Jesuit schools, preparatory school, and at Georgetown, which is Jesuit school. And but one always has that residue of doubt. I mean, the Jesuits are those who taught me to think. And the moment you begin to think, you begin to doubt, of course, and you have all the tools for doubt in logic and the various philosophy courses. I thought, if all of these events can be verified that I've heard about in this particular case of possession, it would seem to corroborate all that I have been taught, or a great deal of it. Certainly the life of the spirit, or a life after death, or personal immortality. Certainly a world of, not of devils, but I mean that's a mythic word that hangs us up. But if we simply think disembodied, malevolent intelligences.
Disembodied, malevolent intelligences.
Let's score that one.
You have an idea now what we're going to be talking about for the next hour or so, and we will continue with William Peter Blatty in a moment. Do you personally make a distinction between the psychological phenomena involved in all of this experience and a force totally removed from the individual psyche? Do you make that total distinction in your work?
Yes, I do. I'm aware that possibly, and I say possibly only because one cannot necessarily verify observations made in, say, the 18th century or prior to that time, psychiatrically. So let's say 90%, 95% of all the reported cases of possession, both by either spirits of the dead or so-called demons, are the product of mental disorder. And there are certain mental disturbances which have some common symptomology with possession. Among these are epilepsy, schizophrenia, and paranoia when coupled with dual personality, psychasthenia to some extent, and mostly hysteria usually is thought to be the cause of most cases. But in certain cases where there has been competent psychiatric help available, has been called in, there has been a thorough investigation, and there have been authenticated and verified paranormal phenomena accompanying the manifestation, and where the victim insists that he or she are not the original and authentic personality, but either a demon or the spirit of someone dead, then we begin to get into mysticism when we try to resort to a so-called natural or materialistic explanation then the explanations become so far out. Any man of reason would have difficulty accepting the massive coincidences involved in all of these events and manifestations taken together. So I believe that in certain cases, the simplest explanation available, and that's the one that science demands we always utilize, isn't it? The simplest explanation that accommodates all the facts, is that in some cases a disembodied intelligence has somehow penetrated the integrity of a human personality and taken it over. Now, however, I'm really going to deep water here, but I believe that even in those cases where I believe the possession is genuine possession, where it is a personality or an energy or an intelligence exterior to the original personality that's involved, even here there usually seems to be a mental or an emotional disorder present of some kind.
I see.
As the precondition. One is tempted to quickly jump to putting an equal sign between the two. Mental disorder equals the possession. But these mental disorders do not account for all of the manifestations. And, if you think, Aldous Huxley wrote an essay called The Doors
of Perception?
Yeah, well, that's not the one I mean, though. Yes, it is The Doors of Perception. I was thinking The Gates of Heaven and Hell or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
The Doors of Perception, in which he goes back to Henri Bergson's theory that the human brain is really a shield against reality. So that when one takes peyote or any of the something like lysergic acid, the hallucinogenics, what is happening, in fact, is not that you're hallucinating. It's that the shield has been lowered, and you're being bombarded with the actual sensations, some of them, of reality.
That the light is actually coming through.
Right.
Yeah.
And if it all came through at once, you see, that's why you need the shield. You would be paralyzed, totally incapable of any action. One would sit contemplating the beauty of a rose forever, or the sound of a...
If not a shield, at least a visor, perhaps.
Right, fine. Well, isn't it possible that in possession, the mental disorder has weakened, again, lowered that shield or the visor, or has so compromised the integrity of the personality that it's no longer the invulnerable shield that it has been, and the way is open now. There is a chink in that armor. In other words, you're sick and shattered. That's what, again, lowered that shield or the visor, or has so compromised the integrity of the personality that it's no longer the invulnerable shield that it has been, and the way is open now. There is a chink in that armor. In other words, you're sick and shattered. That's what schizophrenia means, doesn't it? A shattering of the personality. And isn't it true that, or it's interesting to note, certainly, that children are most always immediately susceptible to a complete takeover in possession, whether real or genuine, because their personalities haven't come totally organized and fully glued together yet, so that they're extremely vulnerable to an immediate takeover, whether, product of a mental disorder or real possession.
Could you describe for us, in whatever detail you care to share with us, an actual documented case that you have either personally documented, personally observed, or a case that you're absolutely satisfied a person was possessed by a demonic force? Could you tell us about one?
Well, the case in 1947 is the strongest,
Please.
I would say. To recap briefly, the victim, I don't think I mentioned this before, it was a 14-year-old boy. Single parent. No history of... the parent was the mother, very well-to-do, apparently a Washington matron. No history of hysteria in the boy's background, any psychological disorders. Began with... I don't know if there's any causal connection at all, but he was very deep into a Ouija board about the time the manifestations began. His first complaint, and it's rather similar to one in The Exorcist with the little girl Reagan, was that his bed was shaking, and then the complaint became more bizarre, namely that the bed was moving, traveling across the room. And finally, the complaint was that he was being thrown out of the bed by an invisible agent of some kind. And the boy, by this point, was really in a state of hysteria and had been taken to various, first the family physician, and finally a psychiatrist. And it was thought that he was, this was either a conscious attention-getting tactic, or, since he seemed to be in a genuine state of terror, more likely he was unconsciously throwing himself out of the bed, or maybe was in a state of automatic somnambulism.
Mm-hmm.
At any rate, I know of two observers who were posted in the room at different times. One was the minister, and there will be many people who are listening to us now who will immediately hold his testimony suspect because he has a vested interest in the supernatural. So we will eliminate him and go to the second. I don't question his integrity personally, but there are many people here who will.
Sure.
Was the president of an electronics firm, which was located on K Street, to be a little more specific, in Washington, D.C., was posted in the room in which there were twin beds. And there was a disturbance, and he, on several nights, reported that the boy was being thrown out of the bed, and this is what he saw. He saw repeatedly the two lateral ends or legs of the bed jerking up completely off the ground, perhaps a foot, I'm only guessing. It was sufficient, and with enough force to send the boy flying out of the bed, like those, remember, you ever been in Coney Island? You hit the bullseye, and the little girl in the bikini gets thrown into a bucket of water.
Yes, I do remember.
Out of her mattress. Well, this is what was happening. They even repeated this in an experimental situation, which they would attempt to tie the boy to a chair and do various things like this. It was at this point, I believe, that the woman finally resorted to taking the boy to Menninger, because it was certainly within the realm of possibility. There were theories current even then, about what causes poltergeist activity and PK and telekinesis and all this, disturbed adolescent mental energy and whatever. But he was taken to Menninger. His symptoms could not, in all cases, be accounted for. Some of the paranormal activities continued. I'm not certain that the incident with the bed persisted, but there were some instances of telekinesis and apparently uncaused sounds, heavy knockings. And another symptom was, again, one which I have used in The Exorcist, the appearance of obscene words on the boy's chest.
Explain that for people who haven't read the book and don't understand that. What do you mean the appearance?
Words, obscene words, would appear in letters of flesh, of raised flesh. The flesh would raise up into the form of letters on the chest of the victim.
Almost like goosebumps altogether.
Yes, in bas relief. The flesh would go up. And there were, in every case, obscenities at this time. The first dermatographia was suspected as a possibility. People with ultra-sensitive skin. If you just trace your finger lightly over that skin, a line will appear and remain there for a little while.
I see.
That was not true. The boy was in restraining straps a good part of the time when this particular manifestation occurred. One would, I can... and the little girl in the bikini gets thrown into a bucket of water.
I do remember.
Out of her mattress. Well, this is what was happening. They even repeated this in an experimental situation, which they would attempt to tie the boy to a chair and do various things like this. It was at this point, I believe, that the woman finally resorted to taking the boy to Menninger, because it was certainly within the realm of possibility. There were theories current even then, about what causes poltergeist activity and PK and telekinesis and all this, disturbed adolescent mental energy and whatever. But he was taken to Menninger. His symptoms could not, in all cases, be accounted for. Some of the paranormal activities continued. I'm not certain that The incident with the bed persisted, but there were some instances of telekinesis and apparently uncaused sounds, heavy knockings. And another symptom was, again, one which I have used in The Exorcist, the appearance of obscene words on the boy's chest.
Explain that for people who haven't read the book and don't understand that. What do you mean the appearance?
Words, obscene words, would appear in letters of flesh, of raised flesh. The flesh would raise up into the form of letters on the chest of the victim.
Almost like goosebumps altogether.
Yes, in bas relief. The flesh
Yes.
would go up. And there were, in every case, obscenities at this time. First, dermatographia was suspected as a possibility. People with ultra-sensitive skin. If you just trace your finger lightly over that skin, a line will appear and remain there for a little while.
I see.
That was not true. The boy was in restraining straps a good part of the time when this particular manifestation occurred. One would, I can almost see some of your listeners shaking their heads in incredulity, but I have read reports of this phenomenon in the literature in two other cases which are totally apart from reports of possession. One was by a prison psychiatrist who reported in the journals that one of his patients could, in a state of self-induced hypnotic trance, make the signs of the zodiac appear on his flesh in the very same manner. And psychiatry unfailingly comes to us with an explanation for this, of course, which is that the unconscious mind is controlling the differential of blood flow, can control it to different parts of the skin. And what it does in this case is send more blood to the parts where it wants the letters raised up and less to the others. So you get words or symbols, which, superficially is very plausible, certainly. It is only when you get 8 or 10 of these manifestations and like explanations of them that one feels that psychiatry is venturing into the area of mysticism, really, rather than simply accept that there could be a disembodied intelligence.
How has your life personally changed since you've written the book? I mean, besides the obvious, besides the all the bread and all of that.
Actually, very little. As a matter of fact, I am still called Beatley and Bluty and Blatty by telephone operators and receptionists, and I get mail addressed that way still. I mean, it doesn't matter. Nothing ever changes.
I mean, on your personal life. I didn't even inquire as to whether or not you personally ever have experiences with any of these experiences.
Well, I have had some psychic experiences, I suppose you would call them, which are totally apart from the area of possession or witchcraft or anything like that, since I was a child. They're very specialized. Always the same thing. They're precognitive dreams that have never to do with disaster or death or any illness. It's always, they're numbered dreams, I call them, and I dream every night, but I've learned to recognize the texture of this kind of dream.
Tell us about one.
Well, a very simple and prosaic one was the very first one, but it's typical of all of them. They're very direct. My parents came to America on a cattle boat from the Lebanon, and we were comfortably destitute when I was a child. We lived in the slums. But my mother quickly learned what the numbers game was, and she would play the numbers. And she asked me one day, Willie, pick a number. I didn't know. I don't know, Mama. But possibly that night, I had the following dream. A man was playing a pinball machine, and he turned and looked at me and said, play 059. Cut. That was the dream. Well, shortly thereafter, the superintendent of the building, who was the numbers man, came around to the door one early morning. He was up with the birds and said, Mary, you going to play today? She said, no, I have no money. He said, what about some milk bottles? Get some milk. Well, she gathered together 6 milk bottles. That was 6 cents on deposit. She gave him the bottles. He walked away with the bottle, and I remembered the dream. And I said, Mama, play 059. Well, she played it, and she won. She won $30, something like that. Now, the odds, if you don't know anything about the numbers game, I assure you, are staggering against her winning. Now, it isn't simply the one dream, but the fact that, periodically, I guess it's been more frequent as I've gotten older, possibly because I'm suffering more deterioration of the brain, or my shield is falling down. But it began with every 3 or 4 years I would have a spate of these dreams, running from one night to possibly as long as 6 weeks was the longest that it persisted, where I would keep dreaming them and dreaming them and dreaming them, always accurate, and usually nothing monumental. I would dream the precise score of my high school football team's upcoming football game. The precise score, and announce it to everyone. I made a rather large amount of money in the bond market and the stock market because of one of these dreams. I want to emphasize again, I have never been wrong. I'm not leaving out all the dreams that were wrong, where I lost a lot of money or I did stupid things. As I say, these dreams have a texture, and I know instantly this is one of those dreams. I made, I suppose it was close to $9,000 in the space of 4 days by following the dream. I've had 2 exceptions to this kind of dream. The number dream, and again, they were always very, very minor things. I dreamed, for example, when I was in New York, beginning my round of promotional tours for Harper & Row and for The Exorcist. At this point, I had, the backdrop is that I received rave reviews in various periodicals, Life,
I remember reading some of them.
the Newsweek, the New York Times, whatever, a Saturday Review. I had no reason to expect a poor review at this time. I dreamed that I was in Washington, D.C., reading Time magazine, and someone else was reading another copy with me, and he said, don't read on, it's a devastating review. And I walked in and I told Stu Harris, had a promotion for Harper, I'm going to get a bad review in Time magazine, a very bad one, because it had that texture. It so happens that the tour had not been planned at that point, but about 2.5 weeks later, I arrived in Washington, D.C., and it happened to be a Monday when Time magazine comes out. I was at the airport, I picked up a copy instantly, and there was a devastating review,
That's
the only one I
fascinating.
received. Now,
That's
of course, it could be. Each one of these can be massive coincidence or attributable to other little inputs of information into the subconscious. It is the accumulation of a very large number of these dreams, which are never wrong. Never.
Tell us about an actual exorcist. What are they like? What are those human beings like to meet?
Well, in the Catholic Church, which I'm most familiar with, every priest is ordained with among the 4 minor orders with which he is ordained. One is the order of exorcist. So he has the power to perform an exorcism, but in the modern church he does not have the authority to do so. Up until in the 16th century in particular, there were every priest had his own ritual of exorcism, and was all too willing, many of them, to exorcise someone. So that even as far back as 1583, incidentally, the Catholic Church put out a warning to exorcists in which it warned them that most of the people who were allegedly possessed were far more in need of a doctor than of a priest. A rather enlightened attitude for a time like that. But because of the great danger physically to the exorcist, this because of the paranormal strength in possession as in other forms of pathology, and the great psychological danger because possession is very contagious, extremely.
Possession is contagious.
It is. I'm speaking of possession, which is a purely mental or emotional
the
disorder.
syndrome.
Yes,
I see.
it's quite contagious. There have been many epidemics of possession, as a matter of fact. I'll come back to one of those in a moment,
Please.
if I may. But because of this, and because the exorcist must be psychiatrically oriented, the bishop, if it has been determined after intensive investigation that mental disorder cannot account for all the manifestations evidenced by a victim of possession, or so-called possession, And if there are verifiable or verified paranormal manifestations, the bishop will select a man. If he has to get someone from out of the country, he will do that very often. In fact, almost always, it's usually someone from out of the state, or someone on the other side of the country who's brought in. There's no such thing as a specialist in this field because possession and exorcism in the modern church is so rare, certainly in America.
How many cases, like, in the past 2 or 3 years?
Well, up to 1950, it would average maybe one a year, but I really can't give you a reliable
But it is just a
guess.
handful of people.
Oh, yes. I'm sure it's much less today. The closest I came to hearing of one was in Cleveland. I was doing a show with Father Craker, who was with the bishops of the Chancery Office for Cleveland. He said that 2 years ago they had a formal request for an exorcism, which was denied, however, upon the completion of the investigation.
Forgive me for taking you away from the
Oh, no,
central
no.
theme, and I want you to return to it, but
Sure.
let some thoughts come to mind as you're speaking. Are there certain countries where there seem to be more cases of possession than others?
Yes, in the today and the less sophisticated, there was a time when it was uniform
Right.
all across the world, but today you will find it much more prevalent in the less sophisticated areas of society.
Like India and places like that?
Oh, very heavy in India.
Are they usually male or female?
The possessing entity is almost always male if it's demonic possession.
Not the entity, the victim.
Oh, the victim? 80, 90% women. 80% women.
When you do go to sleep at night, when you are alone,
Mhm.
when you do reflect on it, do you ever become frightened? Do you ever become genuinely scared, being so familiar with the dangers of the entire area?
I was once, and that was when I was almost at the end of the book of the novel. I had 8 pages to go, in fact, to finish a year's work. And as you can imagine, I was very anxious to get it done.
Certainly.
And yet, someone who had been reading the pages as I wrote them and knew that a Ouija board was involved gave me a gift of a Ouija board. And it sat on the little table I used to eat on. And as I walked out of the bathroom at about 1 o'clock one afternoon, I saw it sitting there, and wasn't quite ready to get to the typewriter. I rested my fingers on the planchette. I wanted to see if something would happen. Well, 10 minutes later I was sitting down. Within a half an hour I was in deadly earnest, and things were beginning to happen, and I never moved until 10 o'clock the next morning. And I'm not going to recount the various things, because it's all too easy to dismiss some of it with the unconscious mind being the motivating force. After all, I had spent, a good portion of the novel, as you know, explaining
Yes.
the Ouija board and,
Yes.
and how it works on a purely natural basis. But some frightening things happened, purely internal. I mean, the bloody thing. Well, I don't want to get some of it is rather personal.
You're a very gentle and lovely man, and I appreciate you spending this time with us.
Well, I've enjoyed it very much.
The Exorcist and the author, William Peter Blatty.